So good evening or good afternoon, everyone. We are honored to have for this closing plenary 3 brilliant scholars. That is, I should say, a bit unorthodox. So Catherine Dauvergne, our keynote speaker, realized last week that due to her busy schedule, attending CARFMS21, attending it live was not possible. So she apologized and kindly sent us a 22-minute video in which she shows, and this is the title of this plenary, how a global pandemic alters the global imagination. And so 2 CARFMS members, Dina Taha and James Milner, accepted to discuss her ideas and arguments, which is something that is greatly appreciated. So after introducing briefly each of them, we're going to watch Catherine's 22 minutes presentation, followed by Dina and James' responses. And after that, you'll be invited to share the floor with commentaries. So Catherine Dauvergne is Vice President, Academic and Provost of Fraser University. She has been working in the area of refugee, immigration, and citizenship law over the past quarter of century. For a decade, she held the Canada Research Chair in Migration Law. In 2012, Dauvergne was named a Fellow of the Trudeau Foundation in recognition of her contributions to the public discourse in Canada. In 2019, she was honored with the Queen's Counsel designation. She has written 3 books that take a broad perspective on the theoretical underpinnings of the interrelated fields that comprise border law, including how human rights principles and discourses fit into a migration and citizenship framework. Dina Taha is a PhD student in the Department of Sociology at York University under the supervision of Professor Christopher Kyriakides. In addition to various research and knowledge mobilization positions there, her work has also contributed to the Refugee Research Network at the Center for Refugee Studies. And before her time at York, Taha was a teacher, researcher, and graduate student in Cairo, Egypt, where her doctoral research fieldwork has subsequently led interviewing Syrian refugees women who have settled and married in Egypt. Taha's work analyzes unique strategies for survival used by some Syrian refugee women in the Middle East, particularly through marriage. Using a decolonizing critique, her research reveals the striking diversity among a seemingly homogeneous group often perceived as victims. The narratives from her fieldwork destabilize the meanings of existing notions of agency, empowerment, and resistance. So James Milner is an associate professor of political science at Carleton University. He is also currently project director of LEARN, the Local Engagement Refugee Research Network, a 7-year shock-funded partnership between researchers and civil society actors, primarily in Canada, Jordan, Kenya, Lebanon, and Tanzania. He has been a researcher, practitioner, and policy advisor on issues relating to the global refugee regime, global refugee policy, and the politics of asylum in the global south. In recent years, he has undertaken field research in Burundi, Kenya, India, Tanzania, and Thailand, and also has presented research findings to stakeholders in New York, Geneva, London, Ottawa, Bangkok, Nairobi, Dar es Salaam, and elsewhere. He has worked as a consultant for the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees in India, Cameroon, Guinea, and his Geneva headquarters. He has co-authored and co-edited several volumes, the most recent one being entitled Refugees' Roles in Resolving Displacement and Building Peace Beyond Beneficiaries. So I would like to thank the 3 plenary speakers today, and I'm going to start without further ado, Catherine Dauvergne's video. So please bear with me.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Catherine Dauvergne, And I want to talk this afternoon about how the global pandemic has altered the global imagination. So, first of all, I really want to thank Bruno Duperrion for the invitation to participate in the CARFMS conference. I'm feeling a little anxious, which is kind of strange, sitting by myself at my desk, but I've had some real recording problems, so please forgive me. I keep looking away from my notes and back to make sure the recording is actually functioning. Sorry about that. In any case, I am a great fan of CARFMS, and it's lovely to see so many friends and colleagues participating in what I truly hope will be the last ever CARFMS 100% virtual conference. The invitation to reflect on utopias in the forced migration space is tantalizing because many things about asylum seeking, refugee status, all forms of forced migration have in many ways simply gotten worse during the, well, now more than a quarter of a century that I've worked in this area. So in one sense, what is lovely about a call to utopias is that it forces us, me in particular, to lift my head up and think about what a truly ideal state would be, to look beyond critique and tinkering at the margins, and to think about broad, sweeping, make the world a better place type changes. So it looks to me like this conference offers some truly inspiring vistas in this regard. And I very much hope that by the time you get to the end of the conference, you find yourself feeling that way too. I want to use my time to reflect on how the COVID-19 pandemic has altered our imaginary space, or another way of thinking about that, our capacity to construct utopias. In the latter part of the 20th century, the idea of open borders was really a common thought experiment. So the notion that we might be able to have a world without any restriction on people crossing borders formed a backdrop to much migration scholarship. And it was possible against that backdrop to really categorize, I don't know, migration analysts, politicians, even scholars, on the basis of what it seemed that they assumed would happen in the absence of border restriction. So there certainly were thinkers who felt that in the absence of border restriction, there would be a certain amount of border crossing, but many people would, for all sorts of good reasons, choose to live their lives exactly where they already were. And there were, of course, at the other end, those who seemed to assume that in the absence of strong border restriction, there would be various forms of chaos. Anyway, those backdrops were really important for situating different ideas about migration. And even people who were fond of an open borders thesis, but essentially pragmatic, felt that, oh, borders may not ever be completely open, but being able to think about the prospect of open borders is important for situating all sorts of scholarly reflection. And those pragmatists felt also that although borders might not ever be completely open, they would also never be completely closed. Sure, a few rogue states, maybe a North Korea here or there, might be able to close their borders for a while, might want to keep their citizens in and others out. But most of the world by the late 20th century relied on so much cross-border, really economic activity and cultural activity that actual true closing of the borders was off the table. So this is one thing that the pandemic has truly changed. We now all understand that borders can, in fact, be meaningfully, effectively closed, and they have been closed in many, many parts of the world. When I think about this, I really think about the Peace Arch border crossing, which is the largest Canada-American border crossing that is close to my home in Vancouver. The Peace Arch itself is just that. It's a monument, an arch, that was built to commemorate peace at the end of World War I, and that was officially completed and celebrated on September 6th, 1921. So the Peace Arch has just passed, within a few weeks, its 100th anniversary. The arch is inscribed with the phrase, "May these gates never be closed." And on its 100th anniversary, for the first time in its existence, I mean, they weren't closed on the 100th anniversary. The gate had been closed for, for about 18 months before that. But on the occasion of the 100th anniversary of the "May These Gates Never Be Closed" monument, the border crossing between Canada and the United States was, for most people, most of the time, effectively closed. For the previous century, most people reflecting on this had thought that that was completely impossible. Indeed, for much of that century, you needed a driver's license or maybe not much more as a form of identification to cross that border. So the capacity to close borders has changed our vision of utopia. For all that the pandemic has united the globe, or at least the WHO is trying very hard to push out the line that we cannot be safe until every one of us is safe. What the pandemic has mostly done has been to strongly reinscribe the border. Pandemic outcomes are dramatically influenced by national policy decisions, and we've heard a lot about national policy in the form of vaccine nationalism, healthcare policy changes, even safety measures. Governments have restricted movements in unprecedented ways, not only at national borders, but also at very local levels. So I'm sure that many will recall the stories of early on in the pandemic, French towns where people were restricted from traveling more than a kilometer from their home, Italian cities where the only way that you could walk outside is if you were walking your dog. I strongly remember the images of Melbourne, Australia, where armed police members or members of the army were turned into the streets to help enforce the first rounds of lockdown. These are forms of movement restriction that we have just never seen before. How does it change our imaginary? Well, for people like me who thought that it was probably completely impossible in any pragmatic way to truly, fully restrict movement, we really need to think again. And for those of us who've relied on the fact that compassion can sometimes be universal, that we can appeal to some sort of common humanity of people all around the world, some very stark limits have emerged. And this is what the WHO is fighting against. So the backdrop utopia of open borders is further away now than it has been at any other time in my career. But this is not the only way that the pandemic has challenged the horizon of our imagination. So here are 3 more things that we've internalized over, well, it's more than a year and a half, but let's not exaggerate, the past year and a half and a little bit. Here are 3 things that were simply not true prior to COVID-19 that are meaningful and important for questions of migration. So the first of these new things is that policy change can, in fact, be very, very quick. We've seen a number of not only the closing of the border, but any number of other policy changes, not so much migration related. Those changes tended to be a bit more apace, but a number of policy changes related to how states would confront the pandemic have happened very, very quickly. That's, I'm not sure whether policy change being quick is inherently a plus or a minus, but I tend to put it in the positive column because policy inertia has been very, very significant for changes related to migration. Another thing that the pandemic has changed is it has really altered our notion of what counts as essential work. If we had held this conference in the fall of 2019 and had talked about essential workers, it's very unlikely that we would have been thinking about people who make toilet paper, people who drive trucks, people who mop up floors and empty bedpans in long-term care homes. We had a very different understanding of essential work. And the placeholder that is essential work within our migration, legal, and policy frameworks has been reconceptualized. So I'm not sure that, in some ways, I think this reconceptualization is a really positive reset, and it has forced us to reflect on how economic value of much work that we now understand to be essential really does not reflect the degree to which it is truly and completely essential. I think there have been lots of problems with the way this shift to essentialism has happened. There's been lots of unfairness, and there's been many problems with the way these policies have been rolled out in Canada and elsewhere. But the change has happened, and the revaluing is beginning. So a recent advertisement coming out, of course, of Alberta, suggesting that nurses' salaries could be doubled is something that I think 2 years ago would have been unimaginable, and is definitely, definitely that kind of shift falls in the positive column, even if the utopian version of it is a lot better than the version that we see happening on the ground. And then another shift, which has been, which I think I'm just at the beginning of grappling with, is that many of us, and by us I mean people who attend CARFMS conferences, who devote much of our lives to working on migrants' rights issues, who are quite knowledgeable about changes in this space. Many of us have actually embraced the extreme restriction on movement that comes in the form of a vaccine passport. And I suspect that I can't put this in the positive column, and that in fact, what we need to do, or what I certainly need to do, is to spend more time reflecting on the ease with which so many of us have accepted these restrictions, this particular form of restriction. Certainly there are people who are out protesting a whole range of things which tend to go together: the anti-mask protests, the anti-vaxxer protests, and the vaccine passport protests. Those things tend to be bundled all into one group, and many of those protesters are the same people. And, that's, I think, one of the reasons why those of us who are at the CARFMS conference, and I don't know, it's probably unfair to group you in with me. Let me just say, I know that I need to spend more time reflecting on this, because the idea of vaccine passport restriction on movement is a troubling one at its core. And there is plenty to be learned, to be analyzed, to be constructed and reconstructed in our thinking about our very quick willingness to accept this. So there we have it. In addition to the backdrop change, in that we now understand borders can be fully and completely closed. These are three other ingredients that have changed our capacity for constructing utopias that have been ushered in by the pandemic. So policy change happening much more quickly, a reordering of the idea of what counts as essential work, a complete reimagining, and our willingness to accept, value, and even appreciate vaccine passports. And all of these things are also part of a larger overall change, which has been ushered in by the pandemic, which is really a recentering of the state. So, and I just want to pause and talk directly to Bruno for a moment. I think, Bruno, when you invited me to talk at this conference, and you mentioned my work on reimagining the politics of immigration, you were possibly thinking that I would show up and talk about decentering the state, because I have tried, and certainly pre-pandemic was working hard at trying to reflect on ways that I thought that the very best, most positive things that were happening in the space of particularly the regulation of forced migration were happening in ways that involved decentering the state. And I really have come to believe that centering the state is always going to be problematic in matters of migration. And in matters of migration, but also many matters way beyond migration, in all sorts of policy areas, what the pandemic has brought us is a deep and profound recentering of the state. We have, for example, accepted, even applauded, government spending at a rate that is probably not unprecedented, because we have seen wars involving much of the world, and we've seen really profound depression in the 1930s. But this is a rate of government spending that we have not seen for in the lifetimes of many of us participating in CARFMS today. And we have also looked to states really as a salvation. We've been, alternatively concerned and proud of how the Canadian state has acted, and we have thought about states in terms of government performance, so that we actually meaningfully talk about, how the United States has dealt with the pandemic, or, what Great Britain is doing. And the recentering of the state, particularly in the willingness to accept and applaud and welcome government spending in all sorts of different forms, has been a very significant change, and a change that I think overall is cannot bode well in the realm of migration. So how do we turn then from, I started out trying to talk about utopia, and I really have gotten awfully far away from anything utopian. What do all of these pandemic changes mean for forced migration, for asylum seekers, for policymakers, and for critical thinkers? Well, principally, as you can see, I think that there's not much that's good here, and that our capacity to imagine a closed border has been dramatically reinforced. But it is really hard, almost impossible, to resist the narrative arc, the arc that is what keeps me going, working in this area over a long period of time. And so I think that I'm going to walk out on a limb and attempt to salvage some positive things in this space at the end of the day. So here goes. There is a bigger need than ever before to create new imaginary space, to really battle against the closing down of horizons, and to look at everything that's happening in the pandemic and gather up these silver linings and knit them together. I read last weekend a story in the New York Times about the United States allowing some small new forms of private sponsorship of refugees. And because I do continue to think that the best migration options come from decentering the state in every possible way, I looked at that and thought, well, it may be that the state is so preoccupied with the pandemic that there are more spaces to take action while the state is looking the other way. I also think that perhaps one important thing that the pandemic has brought us is that more people than ever before in the globe have experienced the way that closed borders alter their life chances. We can, I hope, build from this shared experience to greater empathy. And greater empathy has always been a key ingredient of compelling migration change. And finally, we can, I hope, use the great disruption to collective life that the pandemic has been to reassemble collective life completely differently. I hope that we can grab this disruption and not just move back to the status quo for which many of us are elegiac at the moment, but instead use the moment of pause, the fact that this great disruption is taking such a long time, to think about ways to move to new forms of collective life. I think these are the paths to optimism. And I wish all of you, all of us, the very best of luck with it. Thank you.
All right, so thanks again to Catherine, who sent us this video last week. Really appreciate it. Before giving the floor to Dina and James Milner, I would like to apologize to Dina because apparently I was reminded in the chat box that I introduced you as a PhD student, but you are not anymore a PhD student. So Dr. Taha, congratulations on your PhD, and my apologies for getting apparently an old biography from you.
Don't worry, Bruno. I was planning on making a comment about that, so I wasn't going to let it slide.
Yeah, thank you very much, Bruno. Thank you very much, Catherine. It is such a joy to share the virtual stage with Dr. Dina Taha, someone from whom I've learned a great deal in the time that I have known. Just to let the audience know, Dina and I've spoken, we had a chance to view the video earlier this week, and we've spoken about the approach that we're going to take, and we're going to take something of a tag team approach. I'll start off and pass to Dina. Dina will pass back to me. I'll pass back to Dina before we open it up to the audience. And as agreed with Dina, I'm going to start, and I'm going to start by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you from the unceded and unsurrendered land of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people, and I say that not only out of respect and out of deference, but very much out of recognition that the questions that Dina and I are going to raise about participation, about representation, about power, about decolonizing our approaches, that we have so much to learn from the journey of reconciliation and the history of dislocation and dispossession on this land that we call Canada, and on this land that I call Ottawa. So I'd like to begin with that, and to begin also by saying there's so much in Catherine's presentation that we found so encouraging. This notion of the urgent need to create a new imaginary space, and this notion of gathering up the silver linings and knitting them together gives us great hope. And that's something that we'll return to in the second half of our comments. But in the first half of our comments, we want to share how some elements of the presentation made us uncomfortable. And to start with that discomfort, to make sure that our imagination of this utopia comes from a place of discomfort and yearning, not from a position of comfort. And my main source of discomfort, and I will write to Catherine and share this discomfort with her. I don't want to just say it now that she's not virtually with us. But what makes me uncomfortable is the concept of the we and the us, and how I feel absent from that. And given the possibility and given the utopia, given the new imaginary space that's been created by this online reality, to recognize that the us no longer needs to be geographically delineated in the same way. And so when I think of the us, I think of the other 85%, and the recognition that 85% of the world's refugees and displaced people are not in contexts like Canada, are not confronting borders like the Canada-US border, but are within the global south in very contested spaces in contexts like East Africa, Southwest Asia, the Middle East, and elsewhere. And I recognize my profound privilege over the years to have been able to learn so much from colleagues and partners, especially in recent years, working very closely with colleagues and partners in East Africa and in the Middle East. And the knowledge and the perspective of the everyday politics of global displacement dynamics that I have learned from them. And so in my comments, I don't claim to speak for Urub al-Abed or Maha Shoyab or Pascal Zigashane or Mark Akello or Jane Mary Rohundwa or Ndulo Nyaro. I don't claim to speak for them, but instead I share what I have learned from them, and to share what I feel is some of the discomfort with which we need to grapple, especially when we think of, and when I reflect upon, what Catherine presented as the new turns that we have been forced to encounter in the context of COVID-19. And really to ask ourselves, with these three new turns, to what extent are they new? Perhaps they're new in our context, within the Canadian context, in understanding how these policy changes, how questions of essential workers, how the vaccine passport, these are issues that we've been confronted with in very visceral ways in the past 18 months. But many of these are realities and points of contention that are part of the everyday politics and practice of many of the colleagues who are engaged in this common venture of inquiry and pursuit for this new imaginary space. So we need to make sure that their experience also informs the new imaginary space that we construct. So for example, on the first point, that policy can change quickly, we've learned that in Canada, for example, but in places like Kenya and Tanzania, policy changes quickly is part of the reality within which advocating protection, pursuits of solutions, both with and for refugees, this is the everyday politics of refugee protection in many spaces where state power is centralized, perhaps in different ways, with a different political geography, with different sources or locusts of power, that policy can change very, very quickly. And it tends to change very quickly in ways that can have profound implications for the life choices of individuals. And second, on the question of reimagining the essential worker, well, there has been this great moment to recognize that the personal support worker, the seasonal agricultural worker, the frontline worker, the notion of who's the hero of the pandemic in the Canadian context, while that has been a very important recognition in the Canadian context, let's not ignore the way that the essential worker, the migrant worker, the pandemic has reinforced their disposable character with construction workers in Qatar, with domestic workers in Lebanon, with migrant labor that ekes out an existence on the margins of society around the world and provides for well-being and this growth that has been celebrated through these neoliberal paradigms for decades. It's on the backs of those who the pandemic has shown continue to be viewed as disposable. And finally, what unsettled me the most is the notion that we, and this construction of the we being those who are engaged in an effort to reconstruct an imaginary, that we are being complicit in the adoption of a vaccine passport. I have traveled with a vaccine passport for almost 30 years. Anyone who crosses the border into Tanzania must show a vaccine passport, not for COVID-19, but for yellow fever. And so this notion that documentation limiting mobility, immunization status is in some way new. It's new in our political space, but it is something that has been prevalent and enduring and real and forceful for a very long time, in where a wider circle of our intellectual community lives and works and struggles every day. So it really raises this question of what we've experienced in Canada is in fact something that has been recurring for a very long time in the 85% of the imaginary that we need to construct. And it raises questions about who's part of this community constructing the imaginary, who is part of this dreaming, who is going to, in the second half, weave together these silver linings. Who's at the table? Who's part of this conversation? Whose perspectives matter and who has power? And Dina, on that note, I want to turn it over to you because I've learned, I shouldn't answer those questions because I've learned so much from your work in terms of how we can unpack these questions. What tools do we have to embark on a more critical approach in understanding who can be involved in this essential pursuit of building a new imaginary space? What do you think, Dina?
Yes, thank you, James. And of course, and before I proceed, I also would like to mention I'm talking to you from the unceded land of the Toronto for those outside of Ontario. And yes, I totally agree. This definitely poses a lot of important questions regarding power, knowledge production, privilege and inequality, and also the role of critical theory. So back to your question, James, about who are we inviting to the table, which I agree is a central question and needs to be the starting point. I'm also inviting everyone to consider why are we inviting others. As James mentioned, before this gathering today, we sat together and we discussed the talk, and I shared with him that often there's this mental check that I have to do every single time, whether I get a job or invited to a talk, whether I'm being invited as part of tokenism or because of my contribution. And I was lucky that most of my experiences have been among people who know me personally and respect me. So that wasn't very prevalent, but there's always this chip on everyone's visible minority shoulders that they have to go through. And the reason why I'm mentioning that is I understand now the political pressure of political correctness. But the reason why I'm mentioning this why question is that it determines the direction that we're going to go through. When I'm sure James would allow me, but my experience with him, like trying to come up with the path of how we're going to go about this, it wasn't about the invitation, it wasn't about the procedure, who's going to start, who's going to end. It was about this minute gestures of listening, of building, like of reciprocity, of trust that was cumulative over years. So I really want to stress this like sincerity in deciding who should be in the table and how they should be included. And of course, there is a growing body of critical work, whether in decolonizing research, intersectionality, of course, critical race theory, or feminist geopolitics, that focus on those pitfalls of othering, of orientalizing, of labeling, specifically in migration studies and refugee studies, the labeling of the migrant or the refugee as either a victim or a pariah. just this victimization and othering of non-Western experiences and existences. Even something as amazing as private sponsorship and the group, like a group of 5, had perpetuated some orientalizing connotations around like saving the passive victim other who is waiting to be saved, right? So this begs the question of maybe like more theoretical and methodological questions about the ethics, about field work, about voices that needs to be included. So Dr. Dauvergne brought important and pertinent issues, I agree, about policy, about borders, about security. We did agree, though, that it was focused mostly on the global north, on west, maybe even just the North American experience. So while, again, I'm not a speaker on behalf of the very diverse global south, I would like to complete this portrait a little bit with some snapshots of the challenges that were pertinent in the global south, specifically post or during the pandemic and post-pandemic, because we are not in this together. I know that was like a slogan, but we're not. So aside from the immediate repercussions about like those displaced in place, let's call it this way, like the delayed and limited opportunities for resettlement, family reunification, the mental health and physical repercussions of that. What does that mean for environmental displacement, for example, and grounds for seeking asylum and motivations for migration? We could see those waves later on, not immediately. Also, what about areas where social distancing is not possible, like refugee camps, or internal, like this has also increased internally displaced populations. What about the unrecognized or second-tier vaccines that were offered to developing countries where they still are stuck because of that? Also, I want to bring, like, speaking of the issue of economy and essential workers, what about the informal economy that many refugees rely on, especially in south-south settings, in urban settings? Those, and like James brought it up, those in the Gulf under the kafala system or the sponsorship system, which some may argue as uninstitutionalized slavery, those voluntary immobility. So the examples I chose, I know, are at a different level from what Dr. Dauvergne focused on. And that brings me to the importance of, yes, the level of analysis, like the policy and the state level of analysis is important, but it's also important to bring the individual and the human level of analysis. And that's why critical theory is important now more than ever. I guess, like James mentioned at the beginning, we're going to start with the, yes, we agree, but there's also this side. I think it's time now, James, to move to yes and we both agreed that it is important to focus on silver linings. So I just want to hint a few things. So while physical borders were shut down, it also opened virtual ones. We have with LEARN, or the Local Engagement Refugee Research Network, and Refugee Research Network, we were able to have more access to global South voices, BEAR, or Borderless Higher Education BEAR Center Research. They are hosting an open mic from the DAP camp. How fascinating is that? So there is lots of potential there, and like James, your extensive work with partnership, I feel, would correspond very nicely with that. So back to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dina, and for giving us some of the tools to make sense of this. So in the last third of what we want to say, and so we will be opening it up in a few more minutes. But to pivot from the yes, but, and then from this recognition of the need for to employ these critical tools that Dina outlines, and the importance of having a much broader understanding of who is included in this conversation. We want to build on these silver linings that Catherine highlighted, and to say the more that we look, the more silver linings we find. Dina mentioned, the experience of Bear and the RRN and a webinar that we had together. Shameless plug, I've just put it in the chat box, another webinar series that we're starting looking at this notion of how can we use this virtual space to foster conversations that might otherwise not have been possible. The last IASFM conference was about the most inclusive that I can remember in my 17 years of attending ISFMs. Whether you were a tenured professor at University College London or one of our research colleagues in the Dadaab refugee camps in Kenya, no one could find their mute button on Zoom. It was this wonderfully leveling experience, and the voices and the perspectives that came in were remarkable. But as a consequence of that, the questions that were asked, the research that was presented, the conversations that were facilitated, that's one of those silver linings. To return to the status quo ante would be a travesty, because to return to a world where we only meet in person means that those who do not have access to passports and visas, those very documents, as Walter put in the chat box, those documents that are essential for mobility, the virtual space has allowed us to circumvent that. But more dramatically, I think what we've seen was we had this moment, we had this thought experiment where the actors of the global refugee regime were frozen for this moment at the beginning of the pandemic, where the UN agencies, the international NGO agencies, were ordered to shelter in place. This created this moment, this space where all of a sudden we realized that there were refugee-led organizations, community-based organizations that were filling gaps that had previously been effaced by the noise created, by the productive power of agencies that were able to use their social media to dominate the narrative of who was responding to need. And through the realization of the incredibly diverse roles that refugee-led organizations played, it furthered this argument of the importance of meaningful refugee participation, whether that was in global fora like Geneva and the Global Refugee Forum or the Executive Committee, in context of policy and planning in Kakuma, in Dadaab, in Nairobi, in regional contexts. We've seen this ability to organize and mobilize among refugee-led organizations and networks to claim the kind of participation that it should be part of our imaginary of what it is that comes next. But I think for us as a scholarly field, that the greatest silver lining to take away from all of this is to realize that the voices, this diversity of voices is not just the right thing to do, but a good thing to do as well. That using the tools that we have, this common space of everyone around the world seeing my basement, it's an opportunity to recognize that we have tools through which we can foster this kind of dialogue. It's not as strange, as troubling, and as not as great an obstacle as we may have imagined. And so, I would say I embrace Catherine's challenge of this call to imagine a new imaginary space, but for that space to be inclusive. I would say that the future of our discipline is at stake. But if the experience of the past 18 months is anything to go by, the future of our discipline is very, very bright, because of our ability to engage with and foster the kinds of conversations that ask the kind of critical reflective questions that Dina is challenging us to ask, but to include in that conversation, in the setting of the agenda, in the framing of the questions, to include this magnificent diversity of perspectives, and to make sure that those who have been demanding a seat at the table, that it's not just a tokenistic seat, but that it's a meaningful seat. and that they're involved, they come to the table at a time where we all have a blank piece of paper to be able to decide what it is that needs to be discussed. And so it's within that context that I want to, turn it back to you, Dina, to really ask the question, how, given the opportunity that we have, lead us in the question of designing that imaginary space. And Dina, no need to turn it back to me, just to, what are the tools that we need for this imaginary space, and what are the questions that we might throw out to turn now to, after your intervention, to a discussion with the audience?
Sure, and so obviously there are so many avenues we can go about this question, and I believe we need to be driven by humility, curiosity, and finding the right questions, not by suggestions and answers. But I can share a couple of reflections from my fieldwork and dissertation, since it's fresh, just to tease the discussion with the attendees a little bit. So my fieldwork studies South-South resettlement, or specifically self-resettlement. So one of the things the respondents made me see is a way to reimagine resettlement away from the conventional legal UN sense, where the state dangles to an arbitrary selection, sometimes not so arbitrary, but motivated by ideology, group of refugees, this privilege. So the narratives in my fieldwork introduced marriage as a self-initiated resettlement option. So the women that I interviewed were carving their own resettlement option. And that reminds me of work that's done by Heimer and Reynolds on authorized modes of protection and self-rescue by Chris Kyriakidis, also my supervisor. So this is just one quick idea of how we can reimagine the refugee regime. Just a final thought, picking up on Catherine's important comment on the role of the state, decentering the state or recentering it, and what might happen when the state is busy looking the other way. Here, especially in a South-South setting, how does that actually look in a global South setting when the state has often always been busy looking the other way? So the reality is refugees, and especially urban refugees, often have to navigate the challenges and the opportunities of having little to no formal humanitarian support, along with the absence of too many restrictive policies in the host countries. So this is something that might not have changed by the pandemic as much, but it doesn't mean that it wasn't always included in the discussion. So it's also important to not drop the ball on things that were not that stayed constant before and after the pandemic. And I think here we just want to we want to start the discussion with the attendees. The questions that we want to close with are: who is the us? Who should be included and why? How can we have a meaningful discussion? What are the goals for imagining a utopia post-pandemic? Because that will determine who's on the table as well. What other questions that might be important? Like, I'm specifically curious about ethics in a virtual world, in data collection, data privacy, and all of that stuff. And on the flip side, how would that have effects on partnerships and locally led research, for example? And we're also curious to hear more further silver linings, and I'm going to stop at that and open it to discussion.
Great, thank you so much, Dina and James, for this very stimulating and provocative discussion. We have a lot of food for thought now. I'm going to start by reading one question that was asked in the chat box. Comes from Walter Luzzi, and he asks, isn't the vaccine passport conundrum the result of people's utopian view of personal freedom? We do use different variants of passports to, for instance, access to healthcare, planes, buildings, etc.
Dina, do you want to take a stab at that? Because I think it links very well to what you're saying about, the navigating of informal spaces. And what I thought of when seeing Walter's question was how when Burundian refugees in Tanzania were being naturalized and given documentation that allowed them to navigate the state, the number of Tanzanians who said, I'd love documentation as well because I've been trying to navigate the state for decades, and without documentation, I'm not able to access the same, the same notion. So as part of our conversation, do you want to sort of reflect on this question of how the approach to the requirements of documentation sort of reveals something about the perspective from which we engage with notions of personal freedom or personal liberty, especially in contrast with the liminal spaces on the margins where you've been doing your work.
Yes, I mean, you've addressed that quite well. I would just like to add that this rights-based approach to things is not universal. It's the perception is quite different in many global South contexts, where speaking of, again, going back to the idea of social distancing as a privilege that's not always possible. Vaccine is not always attainable, and it's not perceived as right to choose, but the right to receive. So yeah, I totally agree with that.
Thank you very much. There is another comment from Walter that everybody can see, I guess. So if there are any other questions or comments, please go ahead. And I would like maybe to ask you one question that you raised about the fact, for instance, that the SFM's conference was extremely inclusive, and I found that the participants that we've had for this CARFMS conference has also been, we've been very fortunate to have people from all around the world. And so it was really quite impressive. So I think that it relates to what you asked. What do we do next? I mean, if next year we are sort of back to normal, what do we do? And so I would like to ask you, I know that, James, you have organized the CARFMS conference in 2018, so you are, familiar with.
Yeah, and it's this conversation, I think, it goes to Walter's point about, the power of Zoom and, truckers who join English classes while on the roads. It's on the one hand, what we have found with Zoom is with partners, for example, in Kenya, providing $25 to buy a data plan and enabling that participation through mobile devices is remarkable. Now, in the ISFM conference, in some of the discussions, the point was made, well, shouldn't we just make a commitment that we always do it this way? But I also do want to recognize there's quite a bit that we lose out on without the meeting in person. And from what, again, I come from a position of profound privilege. Not only with my position, career, positionality, what have you, but also in terms of the impetus for emerging scholars, PhD students to build networks. Remote work works very well when you build on personal relationships that have already been established, but it's much harder to forge new personal relationships and the kind of trust-based relationships that are really essential for things like partnered research. I recognize that that's harder to do online. So I think, in terms of what's the utopia for our field, I think, the future is hybrid in terms of there is value for in-person, but there's also value in the virtual. And so I think, it sounds incredibly simplistic. I want my cake and to eat it too, but I think if we return completely to an in-person reality, we will have missed a tremendous opportunity. But to recognize that maybe we go into our cubicles to participate in these sessions, but then those of us have the privilege to enjoy meals and coffee breaks together, we're able to do that. But maybe we can think then creatively where there's a critical mass of people who are gathered in person to bring others in virtually as well. But I think this is, I don't lament a future that looks something like this, because what this has done in terms of my imagining of the realm of the possible has been so much more than when I was packing a strolley and jumping on airplanes. Not to mention the cost, not to mention the carbon emissions. Someone once did a study of the, and I think it was Jennifer Heinemann, who I believe is in the audience, told me about this once, at the American Association of Geographers. Someone did a study of the carbon emissions that were the consequence of everyone traveling to a conference to talk about the environment. And so I think there are all kinds of virtues that come from this kind of reality. But of course, I don't want to presume my privilege that the networking and the network building and the fostering of trust that comes in person, that also needs to be part of our future. But yeah, I think a hybrid future, and for us to think really critically about what's the best of the online, what's the best of the in-person, how do we sustain those and nurture those as we reimagine the future of the conference, I think is a very important thing to do.
Thank you very much, James. Dina, do you want to add?
Yes, just a quick note that while the silver linings are countless, I also think it is important to consider the inequalities and the intersectionality in the inequalities that different populations across the globe face. For example, yesterday we were during one of CARFMS sessions on knowledge mobilization, an attendee from the Global South, from Latin America, she pointed that we always talk about the Global South as one thing, but there's actually there's two Global Souths that it became more evident post-pandemic. Those might have like technical IT issues, connectivity issues that we can recover with like infrastructure funding. But there's also this other group that while they don't have issues with connectivity and even time zones, they have issues with accessing research, open access research. She mentioned that we need to publish in highly ranked journals, and then we're locked out of this research, of our own research, because our institutions are not able to fund that. So that's just another example, and I encourage attendees, especially if anyone has experience, whether they're from the Global South or have experience or partnering with someone from the Global South, to chip in and point us to other hidden or not so obvious inequalities as well, because that would help direct the conversation about what this utopia would look like, or what is the silver lining actually look like.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Dina. And I would like to read Stephanie Stober's comment. She added to this conversation about conferences. Yes, silver linings for online meetings include the ability to involve more people in the discussions who are not able to travel and hear voices from people around the world. There is also something special about human contact and meeting face to face. Perhaps we should travel to those places where we need to hear their stories. Yes, do both online and in person. So yeah, absolutely. Going back to your ideas, trying to think creatively. And yeah, so sorry, James, you wanted to say?
You know, and I gave a thumbs up to that point, because, you know, while it's I remember when we had CARFMS 2018 at Carleton, and the number of, you know, the amount of time writing letters of support for visa applications, but then the needing to set the program far enough in advance so that the invitation letters could be sent, so that the visa could be applied for, et cetera, et cetera. Stephanie, to your point, something that Learn tried to do, the project that I have the real privilege of directing, is that we were, at the beginning of the pandemic, we were just starting sort of a rotation where we'd have one annual meeting in Canada and then the next annual meeting in one of the countries in East Africa or the Middle East where we work. So our annual meeting in 2020 was supposed to be in Amman, Jordan, and of course that didn't prove to be possible. So I think it may be even, IASFM in its application process has been really good in asking for, in submitting the letter of intent to apply, what are the visa barriers for that in-person participation? What are the possibilities for, hybrid sessions, what have you? So, CARFMS, while it's a Canadian Association of Refugee and Forced Migration Studies, maybe one of the questions might be, are there partner associations with whom CARFMS may, from time to time, collaborate to sort of co-host or flip conferences around and geographically where they happen. Now, I also recognize from my own bias, as a scholar who works on predominantly global issues, that's where my inquiry takes me, is into those geographies. So there may be those who are listening and say, but I'm a scholar of refugee integration experiences in Canada. Where's the space for me? And not to paraphrase anyone, but I think that we may think quite creatively about, would a conference in Central America one year be useful? It would also unsettle us with the fact, j'ai pas dit au début, soyez libre de me poser des questions soit en anglais, soit en français. I mean, we've sort of slipped into a very hegemonic language. I've recently been involved in an evaluation process where I've been forced to sort of stumble through with Spanish, which is a language that I don't know. So it may be that there's some creative discomfort as part of this new imaginary space. I think what Dina and I really sort of settled on from the outset in thinking of the conversation we wanted to foster, that let's not be insular in thinking about what that new imaginary space might be and who it includes. Let's be very outward looking. Let's be very inclusive in that space. Likewise, could CARFMS imagine a year where we have a conference in partnership with, for example, the Wikwemkon First Nation in Ontario, one of the largest recognized unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territories in Ontario? What are the kinds of partnerships that we could begin to imagine that would create spaces to have those conversations in person and online in ways where we don't slip into the comfortable routine? And I think that's really what I have found from the pandemic is that there are conversations that I can have and that I'm obliged to have that aren't always comfortable and easy. And that has led to opportunities for growth. But I do want to also underscore a point that Dina made when we talk about, the global South, the risk of homogenizing that, because let me tell you, internet connectivity in Dadaab and Nairobi are two very, very different things.
Thank you very much, James, and thank you, Dina, for your comments and insights. Is there any other question from the audience? Please don't hesitate. No. Is there anything you would like to add, Dina and James?
I mean, it's not something that I'd like to add, but I'd like us to engage in a conversation around how partnerships, especially global north and global south partnerships, would look like stemming from this reimagination of the refugee regime?
I think the final word that you know that I would like to share is very much, Dina, to echo that, and also to say that there are so many. You know, I really want to echo two things that Catherine said. One is, you know, the opportunity that we have to engage in thinking about this new imaginary space, how timely and how important it is. But then second, how many silver linings there are for us to be able to knit together, and you know, how privileged I feel to be able to share the stage with Dina, Bruno, how grateful I am for the invitation from you, to Michelle and Stephanie and everyone who's made this possible. There's so much positives to take away from this time. And that we have this extraordinary task ahead of us, which is, you know, to hold each other accountable, to not slip back into the status quo ante, to not say, "Phew, that's over," and to recognize these moments where we've witnessed and recognized power, where we've been creative. You know, Jennifer Heinemann, who was on the call, said to me, you know, that this term pivot has been overused, but wow, I'm a ballet dancer like I never knew I was, because of the times I've been pivoting all over the place. But you know, out of that, necessity has been the parent of invention, and look at all what we have invented and created and been able to do. And so how do we consciously take stock of that and make sure that in the comfort and the relief that will come from, you know, one day when the pandemic is declared or believed to be behind us, but how do we make sure that we don't lose these moments, these mechanisms, and these realizations? Because the way that we have seen old power stuck and new power rush in around it and through it and between it in ways that have been majestic is just a tremendous source of optimism. So in that time where we return to a non-COVID time, remember, as I said, that when, you know, refugee-led organizations, quote unquote, emerged, it's not that they emerged to fill a gap. It was more that the noise created by the larger, more powerful actors, they were silenced. And so it was in that stillness that we were able to see and hear what had been happening all along, that had been drowned out by these larger, more powerful actors. So when these large institutional actors gear up again, and when we're confronted by those sources of old power, let's not forget the resilience, the enduring hope that comes from embracing, sustaining, and celebrating new power.
So thank you very much, James and Dina, for these very encouraging words at the end of this conference. I think that we have a lot of work to do at CARFMS and ISFM as well, but I think to rethink the political economy of academia and make it a bit more fair. And I think that's what also brings us here. So thank you very much for discussing Catherine's ideas and also proposing exciting and stimulating ideas. Thank you so much.
We have a final question from James Simmons.
I'm sorry. A question from James. What do you see as the most promising pathways to achieving new imaginaries for the field of refugees and forced migration studies as we emerge from the pandemic?
I'll start with just a couple of thoughts inspired by what I just heard from James. And maybe because I'm busy right now working for the first time as a co-investigator on a SSHRC grant, Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council grant. And I wonder, because I know ISFM and CARFMS were involved in like ethical guidelines for conducting research. I wonder if there could be something similar around criteria or like essentials that need to be included in the funding. Same now, like SHRC is encouraging researchers to include funding for open access. Could we, for example, add a criteria or add a principle where the researchers or the principal investigators would include an end user in the publication, someone from, whether it could be someone from the Global South, it could be an emerging scholar, it could be a nonprofit agent. Could there be like a criteria or a condition that someone who's going to be using this knowledge, that they could be part of developing and generating it in the first place as well? That could be one way that might be also be facilitated by the pandemic and how like those virtual worlds have like removed some boundaries.
Yeah, and I think I just want to echo that. I think that's absolutely right. And I sent a message to Christina Clark-Kazak earlier today in the roundtable discussion we had on meaningful refugee participation yesterday. It was amazing how going back to those CARFMS CCR ethical guidelines on the language on partnership, how significant they were. And I think we can, you know, it would be very exciting for CARFMS, for example, to conduct a reflection coming out of the pandemic. What are the lessons learned in terms of good practices, in terms of hosting meetings in a way that's inclusive and participatory, that recognizes the way that we can overcome these barriers. But to your point, Dina, and I've put, again, shamelessly, I've put a link to the Learn webinar page. That's where we'll be posting the webinars in the RRN Learn series, where we're going to look quite systematically, and all credit to RN colleagues, including Dina, Susan McGrath, and others who've been part of that conversation, and to Rachel McNally and the Learn team who've been doing this work. But really looking from our first webinar, which is on the 3rd of November, with Phony Joyce and Elena Fidia Kismaya, and also with Yusuf Kismaya, looking at the question of what counts as knowledge. And then in reimagining what counts as knowledge, how do we forge partnerships? How do we do research? How do we produce results? One of the webinars in that series is going to be with donors about how we change the structure of funding. And, you know, that conversation is happening. So the way that Canada's International Development Research Centre has invested millions of dollars in funding research chairs in major refugee hosting regions across the Global South. The German Development Institute is engaged in a process of thinking about internationalizing forced migration studies. Now, of course, there are concerns about the political economy of funding. Lauren Landau has written about, as funding is extended by Global North into the Global South, does that bring with it the hegemonic policy paradigms? Chimney's work from 20 plus years ago about the geopolitics of asylum looms large. So James Simeon, to your point about what are the most promising pathways in achieving these new imaginaries, I think very much is in recognizing how everyday practices in the midst of the pandemic, everyday practices within the field of refugee and forced migration studies have in some ways engaged with these structural manifestations of power that we've been forced to confront with together, as Catherine says, because in the Canadian context, we've faced these same restrictions and limitations that have defined everyday lived realities in places like in the East Africa and the Middle East where I work. And so from this common meeting point, there has been a more candid and I think a more constructive conversation about the structural barriers that need to be overcome for participation. So if we take those examples with us on how, whose knowledge is valued, how research partnerships are formed, how can they be done in a more in a way that recognizes power asymmetries? How do we design research? How do we conduct research? How do we produce research? How do we mobilize research? All of these questions at every stage of the research cycle bring with them questions of power and privilege and positionality. And what Dina's work has taught me is that, this concept of applying an intersectional lens into each of these moments is necessary to make sure that we're not walking into these moments with our biases and our habits, but that we approach each of them with that freshness that can come with a new imagined utopia. And so I think, after 18 months in my basement, thinking about utopias is essential. And as I said in our intervention, I'm more optimistic for the field now than I have been certainly since 2015, because I think we found a way to start having the conversation and this mutual realization that it's not just the right thing to do, but it's a good thing to do as well.
Thank you, James and Dina. And following your comments, Dina and James, Walter Luzzi commented on the chat box, as someone in charge, so I agree, as someone in charge in submitting proposals to SCC for funding, the opportunity to open the view of our service is promising. So thank you very much again for these exciting comments and ways of getting out of the basement. You're not alone. So thank you so much for being able to be with us, taking the time to be with us. It's been really greatly appreciated. So I'm going now to wrap up this conference. And on behalf of CARFMS, I would like to thank all the participants of this online conference, keynote speakers, presenters, session chairs, and I hope you enjoyed these rich plenary sessions and workshops. And thank you for being with us over the past 3 days, and thank you in particular to our participants overseas who have juggled with the time difference. And we have prepared an online survey that you will get shortly in order to tell us what you liked this year and what we can improve at the next conference. And I think it follows very clearly what we have said during this closing plenary. And before we realize in a few minutes that another world that is not online exists out there, I would like to give a special thanks to Michelle Millard and Stephanie Brown, who have worked tirelessly and have made this online conference exceptional. Michelle and Stephanie, thank you very much. And also special thanks to the members of the executive team of CARFMS who have supported this conference for several months and have really made this conference what it is. So thank you very much to all those colleagues. And last but not least, thank you to the graduate students who have volunteered to assist us. You have allowed us really to focus on fundamental topics and to have invaluable conversations. We have noticed nothing what you're doing in the background, and you have really helped us to enjoy this conference. So thank you so much and have a great weekend. Take care.